Hey everybody, and welcome back. This is Northwest Small Batch Brewing, and my name's Steven. And today I want to discuss yeast. It's probably one of the more important parts of your brewing process. I mean, it changes your wort into beer. It adds alcohol and some carbonation and things and flavors. So I don't want to get too technical with it. I don't want to get too much into the biology of it. I just want to discuss a couple things that you should probably think about and may have questions about regarding yeast, especially if you're a new brewer or considering making your first recipe. So let's get the intro going and we'll get started. All right, so let's get started. So first of all, let's talk about what is yeast exactly. Yeast is alive. It is a living organism. It's actually a fungus. It's a single cell fungus. And it was discovered many millions of years ago. So yeast is far, far, far older as far as a discovery or, than beer. It's been around much longer than beer, for sure. And it's everywhere. It's inside us. It's on everything we touch. It's all around us. There are currently over 1,500 known species of yeast. We obviously don't use all of those in beer, but it's pretty amazing. So when it comes to beer and yeast, the main question that would come up is, do you use fresh yeast, or it's sometimes people call liquid yeast, or do you use dry yeast? I will tell you that I pretty much exclusively myself use dry yeast. Here's the thing. Yeast does need a few things to be able to thrive. It needs oxygen in the beginning. It needs certain minerals, what we call yeast nutrients. It needs certain minerals and things. Generally, like normal tap water or spring water would contain, enough of the nutrients or minerals that it needs to thrive. It's why you don't want to use distilled water, because it's devoid of all minerals and anything that would help basically be a nutrient to the yeast. So spring water is fine. Tap water is fine unless you have chlorine, which is just a taste thing, right? You don't want to have chlorine taste in your beer. So the pros and cons here. So dry yeast, first of all, dry yeast is a huge colony of yeast, meaning that you can take, say, 1 packet of yeast, and it's plenty for a 5-gallon batch of beer. You don't have to add anything. You don't have to propagate it, nothing. It's ready to go. And in fact, there is yeast nutrient and whatever you want to call it, food, within that yeast packet. So it comes in that packet pretty ready to go. And it used to be that you'd want to hydrate your dry yeast first, where you basically put it in a small amount of your wort in a little glass or whatever and give it like 10 minutes, 20 minutes to just rehydrate, and then pour that into your main wort. Nowadays, it's really not necessary, and it even says on most yeast packets to just sprinkle it on top of your wort. So for most yeast packets that are dry, it is not any simpler. You just pour it in. It has definitely a longer shelf life, right, than fresh yeast or wet yeast, or however you want to say it. I think 3 years is generally the shelf life. Maybe even longer if you store your dry yeast in the freezer, or not freezer, the refrigerator. I don't know for sure about that. I mean, it's dried. I know a lot of people who say they store their dry yeast in the refrigerator. I'm not convinced that that really extends the life, but I haven't heard of it hurting anything. It costs less. That's another pro of dry yeast over liquid, the cost. We'll get into this in a second, but liquid yeast needs to be made, needs a starter. So that's another benefit to dry yeast. You don't need to do a starter. You can just pour it right in. I would say the main negative that I can think of, or the sort of con when it comes to dry yeast, is it doesn't have as many strains available. So you have fewer options of types of yeast, and that matters. We'll get into this too, but certain yeasts can give you different flavors and what we call esters, which I'll get to. And so you do have more options as far as that goes when it comes to dry yeast. So liquid yeast, I mean, I've already said that, it's available in a lot of more varieties of styles. It does have a shorter lifespan or life. It's as opposed to 3 years, it's about 3 months. So and you do want to keep it refrigerated or chilled to extend that, but much shorter shelf life. You have to use that yeast pretty quickly. And when it comes to, if you ever hear people saying that they're harvesting their yeast, yes, you can harvest yeast from your existing beer and what we call wash it and reuse it. That's kind of beyond the scope of this video, but that would be an example of obviously liquid yeast. I mean, you could probably do that with dry yeast, but at that point it becomes liquid yeast because you're not drying it. And you would need to treat it as such. What else about liquid yeast? I did say it has to be kept cold. That's another reason why I don't get it or buy it. You kind of have to either be home. If you have it delivered, you have to be home so that you can unpackage it right away. They usually come with chilled, like dry ice packages to keep it chilled. But that only lasts so long. So you kind of want to be home, especially if it's in the summertime. You want to be able to take it out of the package and put it in the refrigerator right away. Or you can buy it at your local homebrew store, and that's probably the easiest way, and especially if you can just buy it and then take it straight home and put it in the refrigerator. But that makes it more difficult, and that's another reason why I don't really use fresh yeast. Also, you have to make it into a starter. What does that mean? Fresh yeast doesn't have as big a colony. It's about half the amount of live yeast that dry would have. So in order to make, let's say, a 5-gallon batch of beer, you first have to propagate, or basically let the yeast do their thing and populate and double their amount, basically build their colony. So there's double the amount. Because if you pitch liquid yeast into like 5 gallons of beer and it's under-pitched, meaning not enough yeast in that packet for the whole 5 gallons, it's going to stress the yeast, it's going to struggle, and you're going to get off flavors and things like that. So you have to first put it in a small amount of wort. And if you've ever seen this, you can actually buy, you used to have to buy like dry malt extract or liquid malt extract, boil it, etc. And then you would take a small amount of that and add it to the yeast, and then basically grow a small jar of beer, basically. And then you would pour that once it's ready into your main beer. Now you can buy canned wort, specifically for making starters. And although you don't have to, most people buy a big flask. I don't want to say this; it's probably wrong, but I believe it's called like an Erlenmeyer. Anyway, you buy a flask, a metal flask, Pyrex flask. You put your yeast in there. You put like however much canned wort, if you're using canned wort, and you put a a magnetic stir thing, a stir plate. Put it on a stir plate. What it does is it keeps spinning, so it keeps your yeast, constantly in motion and stirring. And that's the basics. So that's another reason why I don't buy fresh yeast, because you have to make a starter, and it takes more time and it takes more work. And it's right now. My motto has always been that I want to keep homebrewing as simple with the least amount of equipment as I can. Let's talk about one other kind of yeast called direct pitch yeast. So liquid yeast usually comes in these packages. Sometimes they come in what's called a smack pack, which means that you have to literally smack it, and it breaks open something on the inside that basically gives it nutrients and that sort of thing. So dry pitch liquid yeast is the equivalent of 1 dry yeast or 2 liquid yeast packets as far as the amount of yeast that's in it. Meaning you don't need a starter, because they have enough of yeast in it that you don't have to do a starter. And as I was saying, smack packs is basically a small bag inside of a large bag, and it has all the nutrients that the yeast need. So when you smash it, it combines the nutrients with the yeast, and it starts the fermentation. And then your pack starts to swell up as the yeast starts to give off carbon dioxide. Last bit of advice for fresh yeast: if you do go to a brew store, a home brew store, to buy your liquid yeast, make sure you check the dates. If it's not a highly sold item, it may be outdated, and because it has a short shelf life, just be careful that you're checking the date, like the sell date on it. Wild yeast. So there is some beer that's made with wild yeast. It's all around us, just like a sourdough starter or a ginger bug. You're using wild yeast. Now, I could only find evidence of one place on this planet that does this, but I could swear I remember reading somewhere that 2 places do it. But the place that I was able to find is in the Seine Valley region of Belgium. They make a wild yeast beer. It's oftentimes called lambic style. I like it. It's at least the fruity lambic beers are very tangy and almost like champagne in a way. So making beer with these specialty cultures, this wild yeast, is less precise because you're not using a specific strain of yeast. And that's why you make it in this particular region, because they have a specific yeast in the air there that works well. But because it's unpredictable what you're going to get, it's less precise, less predictable than brewing with a single yeast strain, which is what we would normally do. Last thing I want to talk about, now that you understand, fresh or whatever, liquid versus dry yeast, is esters. And this is the main reason why you would pick different kinds of yeast, besides the fact that some have different tolerance, meaning how much alcohol they can spew out, and different flocculation rates and that sort of thing. But for us, if you're fairly new to brewing, the other reason is esters. Esters are aromas, basically, that the yeast give off. Sometimes it's wanted, and sometimes it's not wanted. So a lot of times you could refer to them as like fruity sort of taste or smells that the yeast give off. Sometimes it's because the yeast is stressed, and sometimes it's just the natural esters that it gives off. So picking a yeast that gives off the esters or flavors or smells that you want to work with the style of beer that you're making is why you would pick a certain yeast. How are esters formed? They're formed by a reaction between organic acids that are in the yeast and alcohols that are created during the fermentation process. So really, the yeast creates its own esters. And I guess last, I'll give you an examples of different kinds of esters, so you kind of have an idea of what I'm talking about, what kind of flavors that you would get from it. And I'll probably pronounce these wrong, but Isoamyl acetate is one of them. It gives like a banana or a pear sort of flavor or aroma. Ethyl acetate is a light, fruity, sort of solvent almost ester. Ethyl caprylate is an apple ester, so you can get an appley flavor. Ethyl caproate is also an apple sort of ester, but it also adds like an anise flavor, which is sort of like a black licorice. So apple and black licorice sort of ester. And then you have phenylethyl. Phenylethyl? I'm going to go with that. Acetate, which is more of like a honey or a rose hip honey sort of ester or flavor. Anyway, you get the idea that, it sort of can complement whatever beer you're making, so the yeast you pick. That's not the only reason you should pick a yeast. Some yeasts are more what we call clean than others, where they give off fewer esters. A lot of beer at home, we use Safel 05, which is a yeast that is very clean, meaning it doesn't have a lot of esters, and it's not going to contribute many extra flavors to the beer, and it finishes very clean. But there's sometimes you have to pick a yeast, especially with wine and mead. You have to pick a yeast that has an alcohol tolerance that can handle the amount of alcohol that it's going to make. You put more sugars in your product, the yeast has to be able to handle that extra sugar. And ale yeast would not, because ale typically is going to be like 5%, 7%, whatever alcohol. And then there's flocculation rates, how it falls out of suspension. So all that stuff matters, but I think if you're talking about you're just getting into beer brewing or learning about it, I think the biggest decision to make is, do you do dry or you do liquid? Once you decide that, then you can decide of those two categories, what's the best yeast for the style of beer or product that I'm making. So listen, guys, thanks for staying till the end. I know that wasn't super scientific and didn't go into the huge amount of biology that has to do with yeast, but you can certainly research that stuff. So listen, I'd love it if you would hit the subscribe button and the like button. The like button helps get my videos viewed and show up in the algorithms for YouTube. Subscribe, just basically it alerts you when I put out a new video, which is usually every Monday in the morning. And other than that, have fun with brewing, have fun finding your yeast, and don't get too stressed over it. Keep it fun and enjoyable. That's what brewing should be. So, until next time, keep on brewing.